There are moments in life when prayer is no longer optional. It becomes urgent. Not because something is visibly wrong, but because something is quietly working against you. You may not see it with your eyes, you may not hear it with your ears, but you can feel it. A strange resistance, an unusual delay, a pattern that refuses to break, and sometimes you don't even know where it is coming from. Now, here is the question. What do you do when the battle you are facing is not visible? Because not every problem begins in the physical. Some begin in places where decisions are made before outcomes appear. Some begin in dimensions where names are mentioned, plans are altered, destinies are contested, and by the time it shows up in your life, it has already been processed elsewhere. This is why there are situations that don't make logical sense. You are qualified but rejected. You are prepared but blocked. You are consistent but not progressing. And if you are not spiritually alert, you will keep trying harder without realizing you are dealing with something deeper than effort. Now listen carefully. There are moments where life requires more than casual prayer, moments where you cannot afford to be passive, moments where your response must be intentional, focused, and spiritually aggressive, not emotional, but deliberate. Because some situations do not respond to weak attention. They require clear engagement. Now, this is where many people misunderstand prayer. They treat it like a routine instead of recognizing it as spiritual action. They speak words, but they are not engaged. They repeat phrases, but they are not intentional. And because of that, nothing shifts. But there are moments when prayer becomes something else entirely. It becomes alignment, confrontation, and repositioning. It is no longer about saying something, it is about addressing something. Now consider this. What if some of the struggles in your life were not random? What if certain patterns are not accidental? What if there are influences that are quietly working to limit your progress, weaken your consistency, distort your direction? And what if the reason nothing has changed is because nothing has been directly confronted? Now, this is not about fear. This is about clarity. Because once you see clearly, you stop responding casually. You begin to respond intentionally. Now, here is something deeper. There are situations where people experience recurring negative dreams, sudden loss of momentum, unexplained setbacks, cycles of delay, and they treat them as isolated events. But what if they are connected? What if they are part of a pattern? And what if that pattern continues because it has never been interrupted with authority? Now ask yourself, are there things in your life that keep repeating even though you have tried to move forward? Are there moments where progress suddenly collapses without clear reason? Are there areas where it feels like something is resisting you even when you are doing the right things? Because if the answer is yes, then this is not a moment to be passive. This is a moment to become aware and intentional. Now here is the truth. There are dimensions of influence that respond not to noise, but to clarity and consistency. Not to fear, but to alignment and authority. And when a person begins to engage at that level, something begins to shift. Not always instantly, but undeniably. Because now, you are no longer ignoring what is happening. You are no longer explaining it away. You are no longer tolerating what should be challenged. You are beginning to say this will not continue unchecked. And that is where change begins. Not when everything disappears, but when you stop being passive. Now the next question becomes critical. If there are forces, patterns, or influences working behind the scenes, how exactly do they operate? And how do they gain access to a person's life? Because understanding that changes everything. If something is influencing your life, then it is important to understand how it operates. because you cannot effectively confront what you only vaguely sense. You may feel resistance, but without clarity, your response becomes scattered. And scattered responses rarely produce real change. Now listen carefully. Not every influence in life is loud. Some are quiet, subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. They don't destroy immediately, they adjust gradually. They interfere with your clarity, your consistency, your direction, and over time, small disruptions become established patterns. Now, this is where it becomes dangerous, because once a pattern is established, it begins to feel normal. You stop questioning it. You start adapting to it. And what should have been resisted becomes something you live around. Now consider this. Have you ever noticed how certain things happen at specific moments? Right before something important, something goes wrong. Right when progress is about to happen, something interrupts it. Right when clarity begins to form, confusion enters. That is not something to ignore, because patterns are not accident. Patterns are evidence of consistency. And consistency means something is operating repeatedly. Now here is where it becomes deeper. These influences do not always come from one direction. Sometimes they operate through internal thoughts, emotional pressure, environmental triggers, repeated habits. This is why not every battle feels external. Some feel like they are coming from within. Thoughts that don't align, fears that appear suddenly, doubts that feel stronger than your faith, and if you are not aware, you may accept them as your own. But not everything that enters your mind originates from you. Some things are introduced to shape how you think, because once your thinking is influenced, your decisions can be redirected. Now here is a critical truth. Influence often requires access, and access is not always forced. Sometimes it is allowed through repeated negative focus, unresolved emotional cycles, lack of intentional discipline, inconsistent spiritual awareness. And once something gains access, it does not always leave quickly. It stays. It reinforces itself, it builds familiarity, and over time, it becomes a pattern that feels difficult to break. Now, this is where many people misunderstand their situation. They try to fix the outcome without addressing the access point. They try to change results without closing what is allowing the pattern to continue. And because of that, they experience temporary relief, but not lasting change. Now, let's go deeper. Some patterns are reinforced during unguarded moments. Moments where awareness is low, moments where attention is relaxed, moments where the mind is less focused. And one of those moments is when a person is not actively engaged. Not necessarily asleep physically, but disengaged internally. This is when thoughts drift, focus weakens, resistance lowers, and subtle influences become easier to introduce. Now understand this clearly. This is not about fear. This is about responsibility, because awareness gives you the ability to recognize patterns, identify entry points, and respond intentionally. Now here is the turning point. Once you begin to identify what keeps repeating, when it happens, how it gains access, you are no longer guessing, you are no longer reacting blindly, you are beginning to see the structure behind the struggle. And once you see the structure, you can begin to interrupt it. Now, this is where many people fail. They respond occasionally to something that is operating consistently. They act once against something that repeats daily. And because of that imbalance, nothing changes. But when your response becomes consistent and your awareness becomes sharp, something begins to shift. Because now you are no longer responding randomly. You are responding strategically. Now ask yourself, Are there areas in my life where I've been treating a pattern as if it were a one-time issue? Have I been reacting to symptoms instead of addressing the source? Have I allowed certain thoughts, habits, or environments to remain unchecked? Because these questions matter. They reveal where change must begin. Now, this leads to the next critical step. If patterns operate through access, repetition, and influence, how do you begin to actively resist them and take back control in a consistent and effective way? Because awareness alone is not enough. There must be intentional action. If something has been operating in your life consistently, then your response cannot be occasional. Because occasional effort cannot break consistent patterns. This is where many people struggle. They become aware, they feel motivated, they take action for a moment, and then they stop. But what they are dealing with has not stopped. So the pattern continues. Now listen carefully. There is a difference between trying to fix something and intentionally confronting it. Trying is passive. Confronting is deliberate. Trying hopes something changes. Confronting demands that something changes. Now this is where action becomes necessary. Not emotional action. Not random action. But targeted, consistent action. Because if a pattern has structure, your response must also have structure. Now let's go deeper. The first level of real action is not external. It is internal alignment. Because before you confront anything around you, you must stabilize what is within you. If your mind is unstable, your actions will be inconsistent. If your thoughts are scattered, your direction will be unclear. If your emotions are controlling you, your discipline will collapse. So the first battle is not outside, it is inside. Now ask yourself, what am I agreeing with internally? Because agreement is powerful. If you agree with fear, you reinforce limitation. Doubt, you weaken direction. Negativity, you sustain confusion. But if you agree with truth, you strengthen clarity. Purpose, you stabilize direction. Discipline, you build consistency. Now here is the truth. You cannot win externally while you are unstable internally. So alignment must come first. Now once alignment is established, action becomes effective. This is where many people misunderstand prayer. Prayer is not just speaking words. Prayer is focused engagement. It is where alignment is reinforced. Authority is exercised. Direction is clarified. But here is the problem. Many people pray without focus. They speak, but they are not engaged. They repeat, but they are not intentional. And because of that, nothing shifts. Now think about this. If something has been influencing your life for years, why would you respond to one casual moment? If a pattern has been reinforced daily, why would it collapse under occasional attention? It will not. This is why consistency matters. Now here is something deeper. Real action requires persistence without immediate reward. Because not every change is visible at the beginning. Sometimes change starts internally, quietly, gradually, before it becomes visible externally. And if you stop too early, you interrupt your own progress. Now this is where discipline separates those who change from those who remain stuck. Because discipline continues even when results are not obvious. Now here is a key truth. You must stop reacting to life and start directing your response to it. Because reaction is emotional, direction is intentional, and intention creates consistency. Now let's make this practical. Instead of waiting for a pattern to repeat, you begin to anticipate it, prepare for it, respond before it fully manifests. You don't wait for confusion, you strengthen clarity. You don't wait for weakness. You reinforce discipline. You don't wait for failure. You stabilize direction. Now this is where real power begins. Not in intensity, but in consistency. Because consistency breaks patterns. Consistency weakens influence. Consistency creates new structure. Now here is something many people overlook. Some patterns continue because they have never been clearly challenged. They have been tolerated, explained, ignored, adjusted to, but not confronted. And what is not confronted continues. So there must be a moment where you decide this pattern stops here. Not emotionally, but intentionally. Not once, but consistently. Now here is the shift. When you combine awareness, alignment, consistent action, you begin to move from being affected by life to engaging with it intentionally, and that changes everything. Because now you are no longer guessing. You are no longer reacting late. You are no longer repeating the same cycles. You are beginning to interrupt them at the source. Now the next step becomes even deeper, because once you begin to act consistently, you must also learn how to identify what is actually causing the pattern at its root. Because if you only deal with what is visible, the pattern may return in another form. So the next question is this: what are the hidden roots behind repeated struggles, and how do you expose them clearly? If something keeps repeating, then something is feeding it. Because repetition is never empty. It is sustained by a root. And until that root is exposed, the pattern will continue, even if it changes form. Now this is where many people stop too early. They deal with what is visible, but they do not investigate what is producing it. They celebrate small relief, but ignore deeper causes. And because of that, the same problem returns. Maybe in a different way, maybe at a different time, but it returns. Now listen carefully. There is a difference between symptom and source. A symptom is what you experience. A source is what produces the experience. A symptom is temporary. A source is sustained. So if your focus is only on symptoms, your victory will always be temporary. Now this is where discernment becomes critical, because not every issue is surface level. Some things are rooted in deep thinking patterns, emotional cycles, long-standing agreements, repeated behaviors. And if these are not addressed, the external situation will keep repeating. Now here is a hard truth. Not every problem is imposed. Some are sustained. Sustained by what you repeatedly think, what you consistently allow, what you refuse to confront. Now this is not about blame. This is about clarity. Because clarity gives you power. Now ask yourself honestly, are there patterns in my life that I have stopped questioning? Are there cycles I have learned to live with? Have I accepted something that should have been challenged? Because familiarity can be deceptive. Just because something has been there for a long time does not mean it belongs there. Now, here is something deeper. Some patterns are not just personal. They are learned and repeated over time through environment, upbringing, observation, repeated responses, ways of thinking, ways of reacting, ways of handling pressure. And if they are not examined, they are repeated automatically. Now this is where awareness becomes powerful, because once you see it, you can choose differently. Now here is a critical point. Every pattern has a point of entry, a moment where it began, a situation where it was allowed, a condition where it was reinforced. And if you can identify that point, you can begin to disconnect from it. Now this requires honesty, not surface level honesty, but deep clarity. Because sometimes the root is not external pressure, but internal agreement. Agreement with fear, limitation, passivity, negative expectations. An agreement gives permission. Now think about this. If something has been operating in your life and part of you has been unknowingly agreeing with it, then breaking that agreement becomes a turning point. Because once agreement is removed, influence weakens. Now, this is where intentional action becomes powerful, because you are no longer just reacting, you are disconnecting from the system behind the pattern. Now, here is something important. Roots are not always obvious. They hide behind emotions, distractions, excuse, justification. So you must slow down and ask deeper questions. Why does this keep happening? When did this begin? What triggers it? What part of me is allowing it to continue? These questions are not easy, but they are necessary, because clarity exposes what confusion protects. Now, once the root is identified, your action becomes precise. You are no longer fighting blindly. You are addressing the exact source. And that is where real change begins. Not emotional, not temporary, but structural. Now, here is something very important. Removing a root is not a one-time event. It is a process of awareness, intentional decision, consistent action, reinforcement of new patterns. Because once something is removed, something else must replace it. Otherwise, the space remains open. Now, this leads to the next crucial step. If roots must be removed and new patterns must be established, how do you build a lifestyle that sustains real transformation? Because starting is one thing, but sustaining change is another. If a pattern has been exposed and the root has been identified, that is powerful, but it is not the end. Because exposure without structure leads back to repetition. This is where many people lose progress. They see clearly, they decide to change, they even take action for a while. But because there is no system to sustain it, they slowly drift back. Not suddenly, but gradually. And before they realize it, they are back in the same cycle they thought they had left. Now listen carefully. Transformation is not maintained by intensity. It is maintained by consistency. Because intensity is temporary, but consistency builds structure. Now, here is the truth. You cannot build a different life with inconsistent effort. You cannot maintain clarity with occasional focus. You cannot sustain change with emotional bursts. There must be discipline, not as punishment, but as protection. Now, this is where many people misunderstand discipline. They think it is restrictive, but in reality, discipline is what protects your direction. It keeps you from drifting. It keeps you from returning to what you already decided to live. Now, here is something deeper. Every day, something is shaping you through what you think about, what you focus on, what you allow into your mind, what you repeatedly do. And if you are not intentional, you will be shaped by whatever is most consistent around you. Now ask yourself, what is shaping me daily? Because whatever shapes you eventually directs you. Now this is where spiritual discipline becomes powerful. It is not about doing things mechanically. It is about aligning yourself daily, realigning your thoughts, realigning your focus, realigning your direction again and again until it becomes natural. Now let's make this practical. Discipline in this context means you don't wait until things go wrong to become aware. You stay aware. You don't wait until you feel motivated to act. You act consistently. You don't allow every thought to settle in your mind. You filter. You choose. You reject what weakens you. Now this requires something important: intentional living. Because without intention, life becomes reactive. And reactive living leads back to old patterns. Now, here is something many people struggle with. Discipline is uncomfortable at first because it requires you to say no to distractions. It say no to passivity. Say no to what feels easy but keeps you stuck. And say yes to focus, clarity, consistency. Now, this is where the real shift happens. When you choose what supports your growth, even when it is not convenient, because transformation does not happen by convenience, it happens by commitment. Now here is a key truth. What you practice daily, you eventually become. If you practice distraction, you become unfocused. If you practice fear, you become hesitant. If you practice clarity and discipline, you become stable. Now stability is powerful because stability protects progress and progress builds momentum. Now here is something deeper. When discipline becomes consistent, your life becomes less reactive. You are no longer easily shaken. You are no longer easily distracted. You are no longer easily influenced because your internal state is grounded. Now this is where many people begin to see real change. Not because everything around them has changed, but because they have changed. And once you change, your response changes. And once your response changes, your outcomes begin to shift. Now here is the challenge. Even with discipline, even with awareness, there will still be moments of resistance. Moments where things feel harder. Moments where old patterns try to return. Moments where you feel like stopping. And this is where many people lose what they have built because they mistake resistance for failure. Now the next step is critical because if you don't understand resistance, you may give up too early. So the question becomes, when resistance appears, how do you stay consistent, focused, and grounded without falling back into old patterns? Because this is the point where transformation is either sustained or lost. When resistance appears, it does not always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it means something is working. Because whenever you begin to break a pattern, you disrupt what has been established. And anything that has been established will not disappear quietly. It will resist. Now this is where many people misunderstand their journey. They start to change, they become more disciplined, they become more aware, and then suddenly things feel harder. Old thoughts return. Old habits try to resurface. Old patterns attempt to reconnect. And they begin to think, I was doing better before. But that is not always true. Sometimes you are not going backward. You are encountering what is losing its hold. Now listen carefully. There is a difference between failure and resistance. Failure stops progress. Resistance challenges progress. And if you cannot tell the difference, you may stop. At the exact moment, you should continue. Now here is something important. Patterns that have existed for a long time have momentum. They are familiar. They are reinforced. So when you begin to step away from them, there is often a reaction. That reaction can show up as stronger temptation, increased distraction, emotional pressure, sudden discouragement. Not because you are weak, but because something is being disrupted. Now this is where stability becomes critical. Because in moments of resistance, you cannot rely on feelings. You must rely on decision. Feelings fluctuate. Decisions anchor. Now ask yourself, when things become difficult, do I return to what is familiar? Or do I remain aligned with what I have chosen? Because that choice determines everything. Now here is a key truth. Consistency during easy moments is common. But consistency during resistance is what produces real transformation. Now this requires something deeper than motivation. It requires conviction. Conviction that says, I will not return to what I have already identified as limiting. I will not abandon clarity because of temporary discomfort. I will not trade long-term change for short-term relief. Now understand this. Resistance often targets your focus, because if your focus is broken, your direction weakens. So one of the most important things you must protect is your attention. What you think about, what you dwell on, what you allow to stay in your mind, because attention determines alignment. Now, here is something deeper. Not every thought deserves agreement. Some thoughts must be rejected immediately, because what you agree with, you reinforce. And what you reinforce, you strengthen. While there will also be moments where progress feels invisible. You are doing the right things, but you don't see immediate results. And this is where many people give up, because they expect visible change before internal transformation is complete. But real change often starts internally, quietly, gradually, before it becomes visible externally. Now think about this. If something has shaped your life for years, would it realistically disappear overnight? Sometimes yes, but often it is a process. And processes require patience. Now, patience is not passive. Patience is consistent action without immediate reward. It is continuing to move forward even when results are not yet obvious. Now, this is where strength is built, not when everything is easy, but when you continue, even when it is difficult. Now, here is the shift. When you stop reacting emotionally to resistance and start responding intentionally, resistance loses its control over you because it can no longer dictate your behavior. Now, this is where breakthrough begins. Not when resistance disappears, but when it no longer controls your decisions. Now, ask yourself, am I reacting to resistance, or am I remaining aligned through it? Because that answer determines whether the pattern continues or finally breaks. Now we come to the final part. Because awareness has been built, alignment has been established, discipline has been introduced, resistance has been understood, but all of this must lead to one thing. What does a truly transformed life look like when these principles are lived out consistently? Because transformation is not just about breaking free, it is about becoming someone who no longer returns. When transformation is real, it is not just seen in what has stopped, it is revealed in who you have become. Because the goal was never only to break patterns, the goal was to become someone who is no longer controlled by them. Now, this is where everything becomes clear. A transformed life is not a life without challenges. It is a life where challenges no longer have authority over you, where you are no longer easily shaken, easily distracted, easily pulled back into old cycles because something inside you has changed. Now listen carefully. Transformation is often quiet. It is not always dramatic. It is not always visible immediately, but it is powerful. It shows up in how you think, how you respond, how you make decisions, how you remain steady under pressure. It shows up in the fact that what used to control you no longer controls you. What used to repeat no longer finds space. What used to weaken you no longer has access. Now here is something important. A transformed life is a guarded life, not guarded by fear, but guarded by awareness. You become intentional about what you allow into your mind, what you agree with internally, what you tolerate consistently, because now you understand something deeply. Access determines influence. And if something has no access, it has no control. Now this changes how you live. You stop entertaining everything. You stop absorbing everything. You stop normalizing what should be questioned. because you have seen the cost of being unaware. Now, here is another shift. A transformed life is a directed life. You are no longer drifting. You are no longer reacting to everything around you. You are choosing your direction with intention. And because of that, your life becomes more stable. Not perfect, but stable. And stability is powerful, because stability allows growth, and growth produces strength. Now, here is something deeper. A transformed life is also a responsible life. You stop blaming everything externally. You take ownership of your alignment. You take ownership of your consistency. You take ownership of your response. Not because everything is your fault, but because your response is your responsibility. And that changes everything. Now, here is a key truth. Freedom is not just the absence of pressure. Freedom is the ability to remain aligned even when pressure exists. Now, this is where many people misunderstand change. They think if everything is not perfect, nothing has changed. But that is not true. Real change is seen in how you respond, not just in what you experience. Now, as you reflect on everything that has been said, ask yourself, are there patterns I now see clearly? Are there areas where I've been reacting instead of responding intentionally? Are there influences I have allowed without questioning them? Because awareness creates responsibility, and responsibility creates opportunity. Now, here is the final thought. Life is not neutral. There are influences, there are patterns, there are systems at work. Now, some visible, some not. And ignoring that reality does not protect you, but understanding it positions you. Now the decision is yours, to remain passive or to become intentional, to keep repeating cycles or to begin breaking them, to keep reacting or to start directing your life. And that decision is not made once, it is made daily. Through your awareness, through your alignment, through your discipline, through your consistency. So stay aware, stay aligned, stay consistent. And let your life reflect something different. Not a life controlled by patterns, but a life shaped by clarity, conviction, and intentional action.